The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Everyone's eyes were on the small figure walking toward the witness stand. 12-year-old Sophie Rodriguez clutched a folder to her chest, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. Her mother, Claire, sat frozen in her seat, hands trembling in her lap. This was the moment everything would finally come out into the open. Judge Patricia Henderson watched the young girl with kind but serious eyes. In her 30 years on the bench, she'd seen countless cases, but there was something different about this one, something that had already made her pause and reconsider what she thought she knew about human nature. Sophie settled into the witness chair, and for a moment she looked every bit the nervous child she was. But then she straightened her shoulders, placed the folder on her lap, and looked directly at the judge. There was a determination in her eyes that seemed too old for her young face. To understand how they all ended up here, you have to go back 3 years, back to when Sophie was just 9 years old and her world had already been turned upside down once. Her father, Michael, had died from cancer after a 2-year battle that had drained the family emotionally and financially. Claire had been devastated, left to raise Sophie alone while working 2 jobs just to keep their small house. Then, like something out of a movie, David Torres walked into their lives. He was everything Claire needed at that moment. Charming, successful, and most importantly, he seemed to genuinely care about Sophie. He showed up at their church one Sunday, new to the area and looking to get involved in the community. Within weeks, he was volunteering at bake sales, helping organize fundraisers, and always there with a warm smile and a helping hand. David told them he was an investment banker, which explained the nice car and expensive suits. He traveled a lot for work, he said, but that was just part of the job. When he was in town, he made every effort to spend time with Claire and Sophie. He'd take Sophie to soccer practice, help her with her homework, and listen patiently to her stories about school and friends. Claire fell hard and fast. After the darkness of losing Michael, David seemed like a light at the end of a very long tunnel. They dated for 8 months before he proposed, and 6 months after that, they were married in a small ceremony at the same church where they'd met. Sophie was the flower girl, wearing a pretty pink dress that David had insisted on buying for her. At first, everything seemed perfect. Almost too perfect if Sophie had been old enough to recognize the signs. David moved into their house, though he kept an apartment across town for when he needed to work late or had early morning meetings. He was generous with money, always bringing home gifts and taking them out to nice restaurants. He paid off Claire's credit card debt and started a college fund for Sophie. But Sophie noticed things. Little things that didn't quite add up. Like how David's phone was always face down on the table, how he'd suddenly leave the room when it rang, closing doors behind him. How he had rules about his home office that seemed strange to her. Nobody was allowed in there when he wasn't home, ever. He kept it locked and Claire had never questioned it. Then there were the trips. David traveled at least twice a month, sometimes for a week at a time. He said it was for work, meeting with clients in other cities. Boston, Denver, Seattle, Phoenix, always the same cities in a rotating pattern that Sophie, with her love of patterns and puzzles, began to notice. He'd be gone for 5 days, home for 9 or 10, then gone again. Sophie tried to talk to her mother about the weird feelings she got. The way David would tense up when they ran into people at the grocery store. How he never wanted to take family photos and post them online like other families did. How he'd made Claire promise not to share their relationship on social media. Claiming he was a private person and didn't want his business clients getting into his personal life. "You're just having a hard time adjusting, sweetie," Claire would say, stroking Sophie's hair. "It's normal to feel protective of me after losing your dad, but David is good to us. He loves us. Give him a chance." So Sophie tried. She really did. She called him David instead of Dad because that felt more comfortable, and he never pushed her to do otherwise. She joined the soccer team he volunteered to coach. She smiled in the Christmas card photo even though something in her gut told her things weren't right. The breaking point came on a regular Tuesday morning. Sophie woke up feeling awful, her throat scratchy and her head pounding. Claire took her temperature, saw she had a fever, and decided to keep her home from school. David had already left for an early meeting and Claire had to get to work. She settled Sophie on the couch with juice, medicine, and the TV remote. "I'll check on you at lunch," Claire promised, kissing Sophie's forehead. "Call me if you need anything." And remember, don't go into David's office." Sophie nodded, planning to spend the day watching cartoons and feeling sorry for herself. But by mid-morning, she was bored. The TV shows were boring, she'd already finished her juice, and she couldn't stop thinking about David's office. Why was it such a big secret? What was in there that was so important? She knew where David kept the key. She'd seen him hide it months ago, tucked inside a book on the shelf in the living room, a book about fishing that David never actually read because he didn't fish. Sophie stood in front of the office door for 5 full minutes, her heart pounding. She knew she shouldn't, but the curiosity was eating her alive. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The office looked normal at first. A big desk, a computer, filing cabinets, bookshelves lined with business books. Everything organized and neat. Sophie stepped inside, leaving the door open behind her in case she needed to make a quick escape. She didn't touch the computer. That seemed too risky. But the filing cabinet caught her eye. 3 drawers, and to her surprise, the top one wasn't locked. Inside were regular files, bills, bank statements, tax documents. Nothing unusual. The second drawer was locked. So was the third. Sophie was about to leave when she noticed something. The third drawer wasn't completely flush with the cabinet. She tugged on it gently and it rattled. Locked, but something was definitely off about it. She pulled harder, wiggling it side to side, and suddenly it popped open a crack. Her hands were shaking as she pulled the drawer all the way out. Inside were folders, but these weren't like the neat labeled ones in the top drawer. These were stuffed with papers, photographs, and documents that made Sophie's breath catch in her throat. The first thing she saw was a passport. She recognized it because she had one too from when she and her parents had gone to Mexico before her dad got sick. But this passport had David's photo with a different name. Daniel Westbrook. She flipped through it, seeing stamps from different countries, dates going back years. There were more passports, 3 more to be exact. Same photo of David, different names. David Sullivan, Marcus Torres, Daniel Peterson. Sophie's hands trembled as she set them aside and reached for the photographs. The first photo showed David, or whatever his real name was, with his arm around a pretty blonde woman. They were smiling at the camera, and in front of them were 2 boys, maybe 7 and 9 years old. They looked happy, like a family. The next photo was similar, but with a different woman, a brunette, and a little girl around Sophie's age. Sophie felt sick to her stomach, but she couldn't stop looking. There were bank statements showing accounts with millions of dollars, credit cards in different names, receipts from jewelry stores for expensive rings and necklaces that Claire had never received, documents about properties in other states, birth certificates for children Sophie had never heard of. She didn't understand all of it. She was only 12, and a lot of the financial stuff didn't make sense, but she understood enough. David wasn't who he said he was. He had other families, other wives, other children. The trips to Boston and Denver weren't for work. They were to live with these other people. Sophie grabbed her tablet from her backpack. Her hands were steady now, operating on pure instinct. She photographed everything. Every passport, every bank statement, every photograph. She took pictures of documents she didn't understand, thinking maybe they'd be important later. She worked quickly but carefully, making sure each image was clear. When she was done, she put everything back exactly as she'd found it. She closed the drawer, locked the office door, and returned the key to its hiding spot. Then she went back to the couch and pulled the blanket over herself, her mind racing. What should she do? Should she tell her mom right away? But what if Claire didn't believe her? What if she thought Sophie had made it all up because she didn't want David in their lives? Sophie had complained about him before, and Claire had always defended him. She decided to wait. To watch, to gather more evidence if she could. Sophie created a hidden folder on her tablet and transferred all the photos there, protecting it with a password. Then she deleted them from her camera roll, just in case David ever checked her device. Over the next few weeks, Sophie became a detective. She started a journal, writing down every time David left for a trip and when he came back. She noted the cities he claimed to visit. She paid attention to his phone calls, listening from the hallway when he thought she was asleep. She heard him call someone honey and talk about missing them, saying he'd be home soon. But he was already home with Sophie and Claire. She started using the family tracking app on her phone, the one Claire had installed so they could see each other's locations for safety. David was on it too. When he said he was going to Chicago for work, Sophie watched as the little dot that represented him headed to Boston instead. When he claimed a meeting in Seattle, the dot showed Denver. Sophie kept all of this to herself, the weight of the secret pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to tell someone, but she needed to be sure. She needed proof that even her mother couldn't deny. The opportunity came 5 months after her discovery in the office, in the most unexpected way possible. Sophie and Claire were at the mall, doing some shopping for Sophie's upcoming birthday. They'd just finished lunch at the food court and were heading toward the clothing stores when Sophie spotted him. David, standing near the pretzel stand with his arm around a woman and 2 young boys. "Mom," Sophie whispered, tugging on Claire's sleeve. "Mom, look." Claire followed her daughter's gaze, and Sophie watched as the color drained from her mother's face. David hadn't seen them yet. He was laughing at something one of the boys had said, looking relaxed and happy. Then the woman leaned up and kissed him on the cheek, and he pulled her closer. That's when David's eyes met Claire's across the crowded mall. For a split second, Sophie saw pure terror flash across his face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by surprise and then a forced smile. He said something to the woman and children, then jogged over to where Claire and Sophie stood frozen. "Claire, Sophie, what a coincidence," he said, his voice just a little too bright. "I was just meeting with clients. This is Jennifer and her sons. We've been going over some investment strategies." But Sophie saw the lie in his eyes. She saw how the woman, Jennifer, was watching them with confusion, how the boys looked nothing like clients' children and everything like David's sons. And most importantly, she saw her mother's face, the doubt finally creeping in. That night, after David had left for what he claimed was an emergency business call, Sophie made her decision. She showed her mother everything. The photographs from the office, the journal entries, the tracking app data showing David's real locations. She watched as her mother's whole world crumbled as the truth became impossible to deny. Claire didn't sleep that night. She went through every photo, every document, calling a lawyer friend at midnight, then the police. Within 2 days, investigators were at their door. What they uncovered was beyond anything Claire or Sophie could have imagined. And now, 3 months later, they were here. In this courtroom, with Sophie about to tell a judge everything she'd discovered, everything she'd documented, everything that would prove who David Torres really was and what he'd done to not just their family, but to others like them. Judge Henderson cleared her throat, bringing Sophie back to the present moment. "Are you ready to begin, Sophie?" she asked gently. Sophie nodded, opening her folder. Inside were copies of all the evidence she'd gathered. Evidence that would change everything. "Yes, Your Honor," she said clearly. "I'm ready to tell you about the day I found out my stepfather wasn't who he said he was." And with that, the truth finally began to come out. The night Claire saw those photographs on Sophie's tablet, she didn't sleep at all. She sat at the kitchen table, going through every single image her daughter had taken. Bank statements showing accounts with 7-figure balances, passports with different names, pictures of David with other women, other children. Each one felt like a knife twisting in her heart. Sophie sat beside her mother, watching Claire's face cycle through disbelief, anger, grief, and back to disbelief again. It was almost 3 in the morning when Claire finally spoke. "I need to call someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know who. The police, a lawyer. I don't understand what's happening." "There's more, Mom," Sophie said quietly. She pulled up her journal on the tablet, showing her mother months of careful documentation. Every trip David had taken, where he said he was going versus where the tracking app showed he actually went. The pattern was unmistakable. Boston, Denver, Phoenix, then back home, over and over again like clockwork. Claire put her head in her hands. How did I not see this? How did I let this happen to us? She looked up at Sophie, tears streaming down her face. "You're 12 years old. You should be worrying about school and friends, not playing detective because your mother was too blind to see what was right in front of her. It's not your fault, Mom," Sophie said, though part of her had been angry at her mother for not listening earlier. He was really good at lying. That's what made it so scary. Claire called her friend Lisa, who was a paralegal at a law firm downtown. Even at 3 in the morning, Lisa answered on the second ring. After Claire explained everything, stumbling over her words and crying, Lisa told them to stay calm and not confront David. "We need to do this right," Lisa said firmly. "I'm calling my boss. He'll know what to do. Don't touch anything in that office. Don't let David know you suspect anything." "Can you do that?" The next few days were the hardest of Sophie's life. Harder even than when her dad was sick, because at least then she knew what was real. Now she had to sit across the dinner table from David and pretend everything was normal. She had to listen to him tell stories about his day at work, knowing every word was probably a lie. She had to watch him kiss her mother goodnight, knowing he was kissing other women in other cities. David noticed something was off. "You're quiet tonight, kiddo," he said to Sophie one evening. "Everything okay at school?" Sophie forced herself to look at him to keep her face neutral. "Just tired," she said. "Big test coming up," but inside she was screaming. She wanted to throw her water glass at him, to yell that she knew everything to protect her mother from this man who had fooled them both. Instead, she finished her dinner and excused herself to do homework. Lisa's boss, a lawyer named Robert Chen, moved fast. He had connections with the FBI, and what started as a case of possible bigamy quickly became something much bigger. The agents who came to their house 3 days later were kind but serious. They sat in the living room, two men in dark suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a TV show, and listened as Claire and Sophie told them everything. "We've been looking at the information you provided," the older agent said. His name was Thompson. "This is more complex than we initially thought. The multiple identities, the financial accounts, the pattern of movement between cities. We need to investigate further, but we believe your husband may be involved in identity theft and fraud on a significant scale." Claire's face went pale. "Identity theft? You mean he stole someone's identity?" "Possibly multiple identities," Agent Thompson said. "The names on those passports, the social security numbers on those bank statements. We're running them now, but it's likely he's been operating under stolen identities for years." The second agent, a younger woman named Rodriguez, turned to Sophie. "You did an incredible job documenting everything," she said warmly. "The photos, the journal, the location tracking. That kind of detailed evidence is exactly what we need to build a case. You should be proud of yourself." But Sophie didn't feel proud. She felt sick and scared and angry. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we investigate," Agent Thompson said. "We'll need to coordinate with our field offices in Boston, Denver, and Phoenix. We'll look into his employment history, his financial records, everything. But here's the hard part. We need you both to continue acting normal. We can't let him know we're on to him, not yet. Can you do that?" Claire nodded, though her hands were shaking. "How long?" "A few weeks, maybe less. We move fast once we have enough evidence. But we need to do this right or he'll run and we might never catch him." Those weeks were torture. David came and went as usual, completely unaware that federal agents were tracking his every move. He went to Boston for a business conference, while agents watched him have dinner with a blonde woman and two boys at a restaurant. He flew to Denver for client meetings while agents photographed him at a little league game, cheering for a young girl playing shortstop. Sophie threw herself into school, trying to keep her mind off what was happening. But it was hard to focus on math problems when she knew her whole life was about to explode. Her best friend Ashley noticed something was wrong. "You've been really weird lately," Ashley said at lunch one day. "Is everything okay?" Sophie wanted to tell her. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, about the nightmare she was living through, but she couldn't. "Just family stuff," she said vaguely. "It'll be okay." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While investigating David's employment history, the FBI discovered he'd been fired from 3 different investment firms over the past 10 years. Each time there were irregularities in client accounts. Small amounts of money disappearing, just enough that it looked like accounting errors rather than theft. But when you added it all up across 3 firms in 10 years, it was over $8 million. "He's been embezzling," Agent Thompson explained during a meeting at their house while David was supposedly in Chicago. He'd take small amounts from high-value accounts, move them through shell companies, and funnel them into his own accounts. The firms wrote it off as losses or errors because it was easier than admitting they'd been robbed. But we have the paper trail now. Claire looked like she might be sick. $8 million? Where is all that money? Offshore accounts mostly. Real estate purchases under different names. He's been building a financial empire while living 4 different lives. The families in Boston, Denver, and Phoenix, they're all legitimate marriages as far as we can tell. He married each woman legally, which means he's committed bigamy multiple times over. Who is he really? Sophie asked. It was the question that had been haunting her since she found those passports. What's his real name? Agent Rodriguez pulled out a file. His birth name is Daniel Westbrook. Born in Pittsburgh 42 years ago. He started using false identities about 15 years ago, as far as we can tell. Before that, he had a legitimate career in finance, but he got greedy, started stealing from clients, got caught, and instead of facing the consequences, he disappeared and reinvented himself. 15 years. Sophie tried to wrap her mind around it. For 15 years, this man had been living multiple lives, stealing money, lying to everyone around him. Does he have other kids? Besides us and the ones in the photos? 4 other children that we know of, Agent Thompson said gently. 2 boys in Boston with a woman named Jennifer Westbrook. She thinks she's been married to Daniel for 14 years. 1 daughter in Denver with a woman named Patricia Sullivan. She thinks she's been married to David Sullivan for 9 years. And another daughter in Phoenix with a woman named Lisa Peterson. 6 years of marriage there. Sophie felt tears burning in her eyes. Those kids, they were just like her. They thought they had a dad who loved them, who showed up to their games and helped with homework. They had no idea their whole life was a lie. What about those women? Claire asked, her voice tight. Do they know about each other? About us? Not yet, Agent Rodriguez said. We're coordinating with agents in each city. When we arrest him, we'll notify all the families simultaneously. It's going to be devastating for all of them. The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning. David had been home for 4 days, his longest stretch in months. Sophie had gone to school like normal, but she couldn't focus on anything. She kept checking her phone, waiting for the message from her mom. It came during 3rd period. Just 3 words. They got him. Sophie asked to go to the bathroom and called her mother from the hallway. Claire was crying, but she sounded relieved too. They arrested him at his office downtown. They have agents picking him up at his other offices too, the ones in Boston and Denver that we didn't even know about. He worked at 3 different investment firms simultaneously, Sophie. Can you believe that? Sophie couldn't believe any of it. The whole thing seemed like something from a movie, too crazy to be real life. But it was real, and it was their life now. The news broke that evening. Local investment banker arrested in multi-state fraud scheme, the headlines read. David's photo, the same smiling face that had been in their family pictures, was plastered across every news channel. The reporters called him a con artist, a bigamist, a thief. They talked about the 4 families, the $8 million, the web of lies that had taken investigators weeks to untangle. Sophie watched the news with her mother, both of them sitting on the couch in stunned silence. It felt surreal, seeing their private nightmare playing out on television for everyone to see. Claire's phone rang constantly. Friends, relatives, even reporters trying to get a statement. She turned it off after the 10th call. What happens now? Sophie asked for what felt like the 100th time. There's going to be a trial, Claire said. The FBI says it could take months to sort through all the evidence. All the families, they'll probably have to testify. You might have to testify, baby, about what you found, how you documented everything. Sophie nodded. The thought of standing up in court, telling everyone about the day she found those passports, it terrified her. But she would do it. She had to. For her mom, for those other families, for all the kids who thought they had a father who loved them. The first contact with the other families came 2 weeks later. Agent Rodriguez arranged a video call, all 4 wives together with therapists present for support. Sophie sat with her mother during the call, watching as 4 women who looked nothing alike but shared the same devastated expression appeared on the screen. Jennifer from Boston spoke first. I've been married to him for 14 years, she said, her voice shaking. 14 years. We have 2 sons. How could I not know? How could I be that stupid? You're not stupid, Claire said firmly. None of us are. He was a professional liar. That's what the FBI said. He made this his life's work. Patricia from Denver was angry. He missed our daughter's birthday last month. Said he had to be in Seattle for work. Where was he really? With one of you. He was with us, Claire admitted. He was home for Sophie's birthday around that time. The women talked for over an hour, piecing together the timeline of David's rotations. He would spend a week to 10 days with each family, then move on to the next. He kept detailed calendars, color-coded systems to remember which lies he'd told to whom. He had 4 different personalities tailored to what each woman wanted. With Claire, he was the supportive widower who stepped up to help a single mom. With Jennifer, he was the ambitious businessman providing for his family. With Patricia, he was the adventurous outdoorsman. With Lisa, he was the intellectual who loved art and culture. He was whatever we needed him to be. Jennifer said bitterly, and we all fell for it. Lisa from Phoenix had been quiet through most of the call, but now she spoke up. My daughter asked me last night if her daddy was a bad man. She's 7 years old. How do I answer that? How do I explain that the man who taught her to ride a bike, who reads her bedtime stories when he's home? How do I tell her that none of it was real? Sophie felt tears running down her face. She thought about those other kids, especially the little girl in Phoenix who was close to her age. They were all victims too, just like her. After the call ended, Claire held Sophie close. I'm so sorry you had to go through this, she whispered. You deserved better. You deserved a normal childhood, not this nightmare. But Sophie shook her head. I'm glad I found out, Mom. I'm glad I looked in that office even though I wasn't supposed to. Because if I hadn't, he'd still be doing this. He'd still be lying to all of us. The preliminary hearing started a month later. David, who still insisted on being called David even though everyone now knew his real name was Daniel, pleaded not guilty to all charges. His lawyer tried to argue that the marriages weren't technically illegal because he'd used different names for each one, that the financial crimes were just accounting errors blown out of proportion. But the prosecution had mountains of evidence. They had the passports, the bank statements, the employment records showing him working 3 jobs under 3 different names. They had testimony from his co-workers who thought it was odd that he was never available for after-work drinks or weekend golf. They had the tracking data from Sophie's app, showing his actual locations versus where he claimed to be. And most damaging of all, they had Sophie's photographs and journal, the detailed documentation of a 12-year-old girl who had trusted her instincts when something felt wrong, who had been brave enough to investigate when the adults around her were too trusting or too in love to see the truth. The judge, Patricia Henderson, reviewed all the preliminary evidence and set a trial date. As she looked through Sophie's documentation, she made a note in the margin of her file. Star witness, it read. Credible and detailed. Could be the key to conviction. Sophie didn't know about that note yet. She was just trying to get through each day going to school, seeing a therapist twice a week and slowly coming to terms with what had happened. She had nightmares sometimes, dreams where David showed up at their door with another new identity, ready to start the whole thing over again. But he wasn't coming back. He was in jail, held without bail because the prosecution argued he was a flight risk with access to false identities and offshore money. And soon, very soon, Sophie would stand up in court and tell the world exactly how she'd uncovered the truth about the man who had fooled them all. The trial started on a cold Monday morning in November. Sophie had missed 2 days of school to prepare with the prosecutors, going over her testimony again and again until she could recite it in her sleep. Her therapist, Dr. Nina Wallace, had been helping her cope with the anxiety of having to speak in front of a crowded courtroom, in front of David, in front of everyone. You don't have to look at him, Dr. Wallace had told her during their last session. You can look at the judge or at your mom or at the prosecutor. You're in control of where your eyes go. But Sophie knew she would look at him eventually. She needed to see his face weigh. And she told everyone what he'd done. She needed him to know that she wasn't scared of him anymore. The courtroom was bigger than Sophie had expected. High ceilings, dark wood everywhere, rows and rows of seats filled with people. Reporters mostly, their pens ready and cameras waiting outside for the breaks. Some of David's former co-workers were there too. People who had worked alongside him and never suspected a thing. And in the back rows, Sophie could see them. The other wives, the other children. Jennifer from Boston sat with her 2 sons, both of them looking uncomfortable in their dress shirts and ties. Patricia from Denver had her daughter beside her, a girl named Kelsey who was just a year younger than Sophie. Lisa from Phoenix sat alone. Her daughter was too young to be in court, she'd explained during one of their video calls, and maybe that was better. Maybe some of the kids deserved to be protected from this nightmare for as long as possible. The prosecutors had spent the first 2 weeks laying the groundwork. They'd brought in financial experts who explained in painful detail how David had embezzled money from his employers. He'd been so clever about it, taking small amounts from large accounts, amounts that could be explained away as market fluctuations or accounting discrepancies. $1,000 here, $5,000 there. Over 10 years, it added up to more than $8 million. Then came the identity theft charges. The prosecution showed how David had stolen Social Security numbers, created false documents, and built entirely new lives around these stolen identities. Some of the real people whose identities he'd stolen were in court too. One man, Thomas Sullivan, sat in the front row looking angry and bewildered. David had been living as David Sullivan in Denver for 9 years, and the real Thomas Sullivan had no idea until the FBI showed up at his door. "I started getting denied for credit cards," Thomas testified. "My credit score dropped for no reason. I thought it was a mistake, some computer error. It never occurred to me that someone was out there living as me, buying houses and cars in my name, marrying a woman and having a kid as me." The defense attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Rebecca Cross, tried her best to poke holes in the prosecution's case. She argued that the financial discrepancies could be explained as legitimate business expenses gone wrong. She suggested that David had mental health issues, that he wasn't a criminal but a man who needed help, who had somehow lost track of reality, but it was hard to sell that story when the evidence was so overwhelming. The prosecution had phone records showing David coordinating his schedule to avoid overlap between families. They had credit card receipts from the same day in different cities, proving he'd been using multiple identities simultaneously. They had emails where he'd slipped up, sending a message meant for Jennifer to Patricia by mistake, then frantically trying to cover his tracks. On the 3rd week of the trial, it was time for the families to testify. Jennifer went first. She walked to the witness stand with her head held high, but Sophie could see her hand shaking. She'd been married to David, or Daniel as she knew him, for 14 years. 14 years of thinking she had a devoted husband who traveled for work but always came home to her and their boys. "He missed our oldest son's birthday 3 years in a row," Jennifer said, her voice tight with emotion. "He said he was sorry, that work was demanding, that he was doing it all for us. I believed him. I always believed him." The prosecutor, a kind-faced man named Anthony Rivera, asked Jennifer to describe a typical month with David. She explained how he'd be home for about 10 days, then leave for what he said were business trips. Always the same pattern. Boston to Chicago to Seattle, he'd said. But now she knew. Chicago was really their home with Claire and Sophie. Seattle was Denver with Patricia and Kelsey. The lies had been so systematic, so carefully planned. "Did you ever suspect he was being unfaithful?" Rivera asked. Jennifer shook her head. "Never. He was so attentive when he was home. He'd bring gifts for the boys, take us out to dinner, help with homework. He seemed like the perfect husband and father. How could I suspect that he had 3 other families?" Rebecca Cross, the defense attorney, tried to suggest that Jennifer should have known something was wrong, that no legitimate businessman travels that much, that she should have asked more questions. But Jennifer wasn't having it. "He was a professional liar," she said firmly. "That's what the FBI told me. He made lying his full-time job. He had systems and calendars and backup stories for everything. You can't blame me for trusting my husband." The courtroom was silent after Jennifer stepped down. Sophie watched as the woman walked back to her seat, her sons reaching for her hands. Those boys had lost their father too, even if he was still alive. Maybe especially because he was still alive. Patricia testified next, and her story was remarkably similar. 9 years of marriage, the same pattern of travel, the same lies about business meetings. She talked about how David, who she knew as David Sullivan, had proposed to her on a hiking trip in the mountains. How he'd seemed so genuine, so in love with her and her daughter from a previous relationship. "He adopted Kelsey legally," Patricia said, tears streaming down her face. "He went through the whole process, stood in front of a judge, and promised to be her father forever. And it was all a lie. He was being a father to 3 other kids at the same time." Sophie felt her chest tighten. She looked over at Kelsey, who was crying quietly in her seat. Their eyes met for a moment, and Sophie saw her own pain reflected back at her. They were the same, really. Both girls who had trusted a man who didn't deserve it. Both girls who had lost something they could never get back. Lisa from Phoenix was the last wife to testify. She was different from the others, quieter, more reserved. She'd only been married to David, who she knew as Daniel Peterson, for 6 years. Their daughter Mia was only 7, born just a year into their marriage. "He was there when she was born," Lisa said softly. "He held my hand through the whole labor, cut the umbilical cord, cried when he first held her. I watched him become a father that day. Or at least I thought I did. Now I don't know what was real and what was just another performance." The prosecutor asked Lisa about David's travel schedule, and she confirmed the same pattern as the other wives. Home for a week or so, then gone for another week. Always with a good excuse. Always with promises to make it up to them when he got back. But then Rivera asked a question that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. "Mrs. Peterson, did there ever come a time when you tried to surprise your husband at one of his work locations?" Lisa nodded. "Yes, about 2 years ago for our anniversary. He said he was in Seattle for a conference. I looked up the hotel, booked a flight, arranged for my mom to watch Mia. I wanted to surprise him, maybe have a romantic dinner." "What happened? He wasn't there?" "The hotel had no record of him, no reservation under his name or any of the company names he'd mentioned. I called him, panicking, thinking something had happened to him. He called me back 20 minutes later, said there'd been a change of plans, that he'd moved to a different hotel. He gave me the name of another place across town. Did you go there?" "I did, and he was there in the lobby waiting for me. But looking back now, knowing what I know, I think he was somewhere else entirely when I called. Probably here with one of you." She looked over at Claire, who had tears running down her face. "He just scrambled to get to Seattle as fast as he could, checked into a hotel, and met me there like he'd been there all along." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The level of deception was staggering. David hadn't just been living multiple lives. He'd been actively managing them, adjusting on the fly when things didn't go according to plan. When it was finally time for Sophie to testify, she felt like she might throw up. Her mom walked her to the courtroom door that morning and hugged her tight. "You can do this, baby," Claire whispered. "You're the bravest person I know." Sophie nodded, even though she didn't feel brave. She felt small and scared and angry, but she walked into that courtroom anyway, her folder of evidence clutched to her chest. Judge Henderson smiled at her kindly as she was sworn in. "Just tell the truth, Sophie," the judge said. "That's all anyone expects from you." Anthony Rivera approached the witness stand with a gentle expression. He'd spent hours with Sophie preparing for this, and he knew how hard it was for her. "Sophie, can you tell us how old you are and where you go to school?" "I'm 12. I go to Lincoln Middle School." "And you live with your mother, Claire Rodriguez?" "Yes." "Can you tell us about when David Torres came into your life?" Sophie took a deep breath and started talking. She told the court about meeting David at church, about how nice he seemed at first, about how he married her mom and moved into their house. She talked about the things that had bothered her, the locked office, the constant travel, the phone calls where he'd leave the room. "Did you tell your mother about your concerns?" Rivera asked. "I tried, but she said I was just having a hard time adjusting. She wanted me to give him a chance." "So what did you do?" "I stopped talking about it, but I kept noticing things." Then Sophie told them about the day she was homesick from school, about finding the key to David's office, about opening that file cabinet and seeing the passports, the photographs, the bank statements. The courtroom was absolutely silent as she spoke, everyone hanging on her words. "What did you do when you found these documents?" Rivera asked. "I took pictures of everything with my tablet. I didn't really understand what it all meant, but I knew it was important." I knew something was really wrong. Rivera had Sophie's photographs displayed on large screens around the courtroom. One by one, they went through them. The passports with different names, the photos of David with other families, the bank statements showing millions of dollars. "Sophie, did you know what these bank statements meant when you photographed them?" "Not really. I mean, I knew it was a lot of money. My dad used to be an accountant before he got sick, and he taught me a little about reading financial stuff. I could tell these were accounts my mom didn't know about." "What did you do with these photographs?" "I kept them in a hidden folder on my tablet. And I started keeping a journal, writing down when David left for trips and when he came back. I also started checking the family tracking app we all have on our phones." Sophie explained how she'd tracked David's real locations versus where he said he was going, how she discovered he was lying about his business trips, how she'd watched the pattern repeat over and over. "Why didn't you tell your mother right away?" Rivera asked. Sophie looked over at her mom. "I was scared she wouldn't believe me. I'd already tried to tell her something was wrong and she didn't listen. I wanted to have proof first. Real proof that even she couldn't deny." "And when did you finally show her this proof?" "When we saw him at the mall with that woman and those boys. After that, I knew she was ready to hear the truth." Then it was Rebecca Cross's turn to cross-examine. Sophie had been warned about this part. The defense attorney's job was to make her look unreliable, to suggest she'd made mistakes or had reasons to lie. "Sophie, you mentioned that you were upset when your mother married David. Is that correct?" "I didn't say I was upset. I said I noticed things that bothered me." "But you didn't want your mother to remarry, did you?" You wanted it to be just the two of you like before." Sophie felt a flash of anger. My dad had just died. Of course I missed him. But that doesn't mean I made this stuff up. I'm not suggesting you made it up. I'm asking if perhaps you misinterpreted some things. These financial documents, for example. You said yourself you didn't fully understand them. I understood enough. I understood that there were accounts with millions of dollars that my mom didn't know about. I understood that the passports all had David's picture but different names. Rebecca cross-tried several more times to shake Sophie's testimony, to find inconsistencies or suggest she'd been coached, but Sophie held firm. She knew what she'd seen. She knew what she'd documented. And she wasn't going to let this lawyer make her doubt herself. Finally, Rivera stood up for redirect examination. "Sophie, one last question. Why did you decide to investigate David in the first place? What made you go into that office?" Sophie thought about it for a moment. "Because something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it exactly, but in my gut I knew he wasn't who he said he was, and I thought if I could prove it, I could protect my mom. I could stop him from hurting us anymore." "And did you? Did you stop him?" Sophie looked directly at David for the first time since taking the stand. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable. "Yes," she said clearly. "I stopped him." When Sophie stepped down from the witness stand, Judge Henderson did something unusual. She looked at Sophie and said, "Thank you for your courage, young lady. This court appreciates your testimony." Sophie walked back to her seat beside her mother, and Claire pulled her into a tight hug. Around them, Sophie could feel the eyes of the other families, the other children.
Jennifer's sons.
Kelsey from Denver, all of them victims of the same man, all of them trying to make sense of how their lives had fallen apart. But Sophie had done what she came to do. She'd told the truth, and now it was up to the judge and the jury to decide what happened next. After Sophie's testimony, the trial took a turn that nobody had expected. The prosecution called a witness that hadn't been on any of the pre-trial lists. His name was Vincent Harper, and he looked nervous as he walked to the witness stand. He was a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and glasses that he kept adjusting. "Mr. Harper, can you tell the court how you know the defendant?" Anthony Rivera asked. Vincent cleared his throat. "I worked with him. Well, with one of his versions. I knew him as Daniel Westbrook at Pinnacle Investments in Boston. I was his supervisor there for about 5 years. And what was your relationship with Mr. Westbrook?" "We were colleagues. Friends even, or so I thought. We'd have lunch together, talk about our families. He showed me pictures of his wife Jennifer and his boys. Seemed like a devoted family man." Rivera nodded. "When did you first suspect something wasn't right?" Vincent shifted in his seat. "About 3 years ago, I noticed some irregularities in client accounts that Daniel was managing. Small discrepancies. Nothing major, but enough to make me want to look closer. When I approached him about it, he had explanations for everything. Market adjustments, he said. Rebalancing portfolios. It all sounded legitimate. But you didn't believe him? Not entirely. So I started keeping my own records, watching the accounts more carefully. And I noticed a pattern. Money would move out of accounts when Daniel was supposed to be on business trips. Small amounts, spread across multiple accounts, always when he wasn't in the office. The courtroom was completely silent. Even David, who had maintained a calm expression throughout most of the trial, looked uncomfortable. "What did you do with this information?" Rivera asked. "I reported it to upper management, but Daniel was good at his job, brought in major clients, made the firm a lot of money. They didn't want to believe he was stealing. They did an internal audit, found some issues, but ultimately decided to let him resign quietly rather than prosecute. They didn't want the publicity." Rivera walked closer to the witness stand. "Mr. Harper, why are you testifying today? Why come forward now?" Vincent looked directly at David. "Because I've been living with the guilt for 3 years. I let him walk away. I let him go on to hurt other people, other families. When I saw the news about his arrest, about all these families he'd destroyed, I knew I had to make it right. I should have pushed harder back then. I should have made sure he faced consequences." The defense attorney objected, saying Vincent's testimony was prejudicial, but Judge Henderson overruled her. "This testimony was relevant," she said. "It showed a pattern of behavior, a history that went back further than anyone had realized." But Vincent wasn't done. "There's something else," he said. "Something I found after Daniel left the company. He'd left behind a notebook in his desk drawer. I think he forgot about it in his rush to leave. It was full of notes like a reference guide for keeping track of his lies. Rivera presented the notebook as evidence. It was a small black journal worn at the edges. Inside were pages and pages of notes in David's handwriting. Names, dates, birthdays, favorite foods, details about each of his families. It was organized by city, with separate sections for Boston, Denver, Phoenix, and what he'd labeled simply as C-Town, which investigators had determined meant Claire's town. Wife likes roses. Anniversary is June 12th, allergic to shellfish. One entry read, son plays baseball. Position is pitcher. Coach is Mike Henderson. Another section listed important dates. Boston home weeks 1 to 2, 11, 12, 21 to 22 of each quarter. Denver weeks 3 to 4, 13, 14, 3, 24. Phoenix weeks 5, 6, 15, 16, 25 to 26. C-Town weeks 7 to 10, 17, 20, 27, 30. It was all there, a complete manual for maintaining 4 separate lives. The jury members leaned forward in their seats, trying to see the pages as they were displayed on the screens. Sophie watched their faces change from curiosity to disgust as they realized the level of planning that had gone into David's deception. The notebook also contained something even more disturbing. Lists of potential new identities, social security numbers with notes about which ones had been verified clean, and ideas for expanding his operation to other cities. Seattle, Portland, Atlanta. He'd been planning to add even more families to his rotation. After Vincent Harper stepped down, the prosecution called a series of financial experts. They walked the jury through the complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and money laundering that David had orchestrated. It was overwhelming, the sheer scope of it. $8 million embezzled from 3 different firms, spread across dozens of accounts in 5 different countries. One expert, a forensic accountant named Dr. Helen Martinez, had discovered something that made Sophie's stomach turn. Based on the records, it appears the defendant was using money from one family's joint account to fund gifts and expenses for other families. For example, money from a joint account he shared with Mrs. Rodriguez was transferred to an account used to purchase a car for Mrs. Sullivan in Denver. Claire gasped audibly from her seat. Sophie reached for her mother's hand and squeezed it tight. Not only had David been lying to them,